Good morning, everybody. Colossians 1:15 through 23. Jesus, God's perfect image to mankind. What a wonderful lesson. These are really important verses because we're moving on kind of in Colossians 1, the first part of chapter 1, from what Jesus did to what Jesus is in the verses today, and maybe some of the most important verses about who he is regarding his deity. It's like an important revelation. Like in verse 1, he is the image of the invisible God, the God you can see. Why is that important? Because God can be seen. Therefore, Jesus is. It comes from the Greek word icon. Okay, Jesus is. And it is the representation we can see. It's close enough for a resemblance. Look at, which is, do we think it is close enough for a resemblance? Well, look at John 14:8 through 9. And he is more than a representation that is similar. He is the exact likeness. Jesus is God in human flesh. Look at the Greek word icon again. It's pronounced icon, meaning likeness, image, form, or representative. But there's a second the second part of verse 1 that I want to really focus on here. And it's the firstborn of all creation. God's first creation. So, and we kind of can go back to the 4th century Arius who taught that Jesus was a human from this verse. He cherry picked. You can camped on it, and he kind of camped on it to teach that Jesus is a created being. Arianism is still being taught and embraced, okay? And especially by some of our religions such as Jehovah's Witness and Mormons or Unitarianism. And so ancient cultures looked, and we're going to look at that because I want to defute that. Ancient cultures took the firstborn son, got a double portion, because it was a very important situation. And over the years, the term firstborn son began to speak of importance and quality. So we find it's used in the Bible regarding quality. Look at Psalms 89:20 and 27. So God's speaking of firstborn, which is, and also David, he's speaking here in Psalms as being the firstborn, which we all know he was not the firstborn. But it's a term used referring to quality. So I kind of want you to realize that this is how Jesus is referred to here. Also, if this was a reference to Jesus being created being, the verse would stand in stark contradiction to the rest of the Word of God. You can't just cherry pick one verse. Also, reference Jesus as a God. Look at John 1:1, John 8:58, and didn't say I became. It said, referring to I am. And Isaiah 43:10 through 11. That's another verse that, of course, Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses don't like to talk about. Verse 16 and 17. Paul is saying that Jesus is the creator. Verse 17. Of course, he is before all things. Jesus eternally existent, which contradicts the idea that Jesus was firstborn. He was before anything was created. Another way of saying he's eternally existent. By him, all things are held together. Isn't that kind of cool? Everything that we know is held together by Jesus. And in verses 18 through 20, Paul wants to speak of Jesus' unique role. The head of the body, the church, the brain, which controls the body. The context here is his role in redemption. Paul uses the firstborn here, but different resurrection. Jesus did not die again. He's one of the only ones in the Bible. He is the only one, that even though he was resurrected, and there were other people in the Bible that were resurrected, but he's the only one that didn't have to die again. So let's make that distinction here with this verse. And in verse 19, it speaks in the Greek of a permanency, dwelling of God, both human and God, the merging of the two. Amazing, right? And something we may not ever understand until we get to heaven. And in verse 20, Jesus is as God through him to reconcile all things unto him. It doesn't say to reconcile to God. Because of the gulf, we were alienated and needed reconciliation. We needed to be reconciled to God. Jesus did not need to be reconciled to us. Jesus was the offended party. Look at 2 Corinthians 5:18-19. Reconciled is a past tense here, to coexist in harmony. Now these next three verses, 21 through 23, go and read them. And it talks of how we are holy, we are unblameable, above reproach. And then a lot of people get hung up on verse 23. If you continue in the faith, in the faith of the gospel. What is, and a lot of people say, well, and they're going to do like they did in verse 15 and cherry pick it and break it down. But you can't ignore verses 21 and 22 who says we're holy. We're holy because of Jesus. Mark that down somewhere. And 23 is, if you have faith in the gospel, what is the gospel? It is not you or me or our works. It is what Jesus did on the cross. We all waver in our job, in our marriage. We're not talking about day-to-day walking in obedience. We're talking about the finished work of Jesus on the cross, Luke 18:8. Jesus is not looking for good works to get you anywhere. His faith is in his finished work of what he did on the cross. See y'all next time. Have a good week. Oh.